On today's show, which players take a step back and do the Capitals take a step back in the 25-26 season? Next on this edition of Locked On Capitals.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Dan Holme. I've covered the Capitals for the past 3 seasons for Locked On and various other outlets before that. I'm also the host of the weekly show called The Capitals Minutecast, available wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about which players take a step back next season. The Capitals, their players put up career numbers. It's a safe bet to say, just based on analytics and history, that certain players will take a step back. Which one of those players will take a step back? I'll talk about that. A bit later, I'll talk about the power play reset. That if the Capitals, the players, the team take a step back, if they could take a step forward in special teams, more specifically the power play, that could kind of offset itself. But just to get it going here, we're going to talk about the hockey bounce back effect. And like I said, you took a look at what the Capitals did last season. Career numbers, the first team to qualify for a playoff spot. The season before that, the last. And, you could say that it was the acquisitions that were made the summer before that led to the great advancement of this team. Pierre-Luc Dubois, Chychrun, Thompson, these kind of guys. But when you take a look at it, big picture, you saw players that put up career numbers. I'm talking Connor McMichael, Pierre-Luc Dubois, Alexei Protas, big numbers. So that's the question. Is it sustainable? Let's dive into that in segment number 1. And when you take a look at, hockey in general, and we're going to talk about the Capitals here, that there are players that take a step forward. You take a look at a guy who hasn't scored in forever, and suddenly he's on fire, going on a heater, as they say. Or maybe a goalie who was shaky, the last month. Now he's a brick wall. And as a fan, you're wondering, how did that happen? And sometimes you can't really draw lines to it. Sometimes it's confidence, right? I think that you remember a couple seasons ago when I was talking about Mantha, that the floodgate opened once he started scoring goals, or Ovechkin a couple seasons ago when he got off to his slowest start in the goal scoring department, he started scoring goals and good things happen. And I think we've all seen it before. You're watching the Caps and somebody you didn't expect suddenly has a big night. Or as I talk about a little bit later, Alexei Protas, a much better season than the previous seasons. And then the opposite happens, of course, as well. Stars who usually light it up but can't buy a goal. Again, Alex Ovechkin from a couple seasons ago to start the season. Sometimes it's just being unlucky. I hate to say it because you hate to think that luck factors into it, but pucks bounce off posts, roll wide, hit the goalie's toe. You name it, it looks like bad luck. But over the stretch of an NHL season, things usually balance out. And if you listen to this show, I reference this quite often. This is from the HBO's 24/7 Penguins Capitals Road to the Winter Classic. They said, quote, "Those who know the sport best will tell you that hockey has a certain rhythm to it. Every shift, every game, and every season is inevitably packed with ups and downs. Teams are never as bad as they appear during their lowest points and never as good as they seem during their highest ones. The very best teams may not just be talented, but resilient, not just hungry, but focused. Their sport demands it," unquote. And I think that exemplifies what I'm talking about, that when we take a look at the season, there's highs and lows of the season, and then there's just the organization taking steps forward and back. And that's what I call the bounce back effect. Hockey has the way of evening things out. You'll get stretches where players look like all-stars and stretches where they look like maybe they shouldn't even be playing in the NHL. And you know why this matters, I guess more specifically for me, is because last year, the Capitals did good things. They led the NHL in shooting percentage where it mattered across all strengths everywhere. So you have to kind of start asking yourself, they did some really good things last season. Is it sustainable? Can they duplicate or improve on that success from last year? It's going to be tough because are leaning into youth this coming season much more than they have in previous seasons. Listen, they still have the core there. You have Ovechkin, Wilson, Carlson, these kind of guys, but you might just see players take on a bigger role. Think Ryan Leonard, perhaps even Miroshnichenko, Andrew Cristall, these kind of guys that, guys that knocked it out of the park at the college level or perhaps at the AHL level doesn't always translate to the bigs or under the big lights of the NHL. And just as an example, we'll talk about one of the most dynamic players on the team putting up big numbers and just how they were knocking it out of the park. What a blast it was last year to watch. Goals were coming from everywhere. And, you talk about Protas, big Alexei Protas popping 30 goals. Tell me if you had that on your bingo card to start the season. I don't believe it. You had Wilson chipping in, Dubois bouncing back, McMichael putting up numbers. But the thing is, it's really, really hard to stay that hot. And listen, I drink the Kool-Aid on the Capitals all the time. But when I was taking a look at the numbers, some of them were career numbers, and career numbers don't indicate a pattern of growth. They show that in a one-off season that they were good. In order to judge fairly, to quantify what kind of success is to have sustained success. So say you take a look at Protas, you take a look at McMichael, these kind of guys that put up big numbers, can they continue to keep doing that? Because if you take a look at some past seasons, talking about big number 43, Tom Wilson's shortened 2020-21 season, he was scoring on 17% of his shots, way above his career average. The following season, he's back, or next year after that, he's back down to closer to 12%. Still good, still valuable, but not quite on the same heater that he was before. And a good example, Wilson putting up big numbers, career numbers as well. Or, if you want to take a look at the big man himself, Alex Ovechkin, greatest goal scorer ever. He's even had years where the puck just didn't go at the same rate. He had a 9% shooting season all the way back in the 2016-2017 season, 9% for Ovi. The next year, he's back up to 13%. So when you take a look at it, it's not just these young guys, it is established players. In this example, I pointed to Ovechkin, I pointed to Wilson, that even some of the best players in the league can take a step back. So if regression can hit anyone, it can hit literally anyone when it hits a guy like Alex Ovechkin. But, I think what separates Alex Ovechkin from the rest of a lot of other players is you saw that bounce back. Like I referenced a couple seasons ago, his slowest start ever put up big numbers this last season. A huge part of the Capitals' success, there is no doubt, catching, passing, Wayne Gretzky, and doing it while missing a substantial amount of time with that leg injury. So that is the big part here. But when you take a look at it, this is the part Caps fans don't love hearing, but it is a reality. Will this team take a step back? Now here's where it gets interesting for a team like the Capitals, who are trying to stay in the playoff picture. And, that's the thing. I'm kind of already having them projected to be in the playoffs, a really early take here in August. But it's going to be difficult because, like I said earlier, they're sneaking in younger guys into the lineup. And the question is, who takes the hit when the percentages cool off? That they're going to need to see a whole lot more from the players, the younger players. That, you take a look at Cristall, who knocked it out of the park last season for Spokane and Kelowna. We're going to need to see that on the Capitals if he makes that team. Is Miroshnichenko, is he going to demonstrate sustainability when we necessarily haven't seen that from him in the past? Big questions. Ryan Leonard, can he find a bit of that same offensive groove that he did for Boston College on the big team here? Big questions that they're going to have to answer. It's going to be an interesting season to watch. Do the Capitals, in fact, take a step forward, or do they take a step back? After the break, I'll talk about 3 players that very well might take a step back. I'll discuss straight ahead. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's where Monarch Money comes in. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings you your entire financial life together. A clean, easy to use interface on your laptop or on your phone. Monarch does the heavy lifting. You can link all of your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smarter categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without even touching a spreadsheet. And one of the things that I loved about it was I didn't realize I was paying for 2 Netflix subscriptions. I also saw that I was doing some good things by spending money for retirement, and some not so good things about spending too much money on sports memorabilia and eating out. And if you have a significant other in your life, you can help plan your financial future together. That is what I love about Monarch Money, and I know you will too. So don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with the code LOCKEDONNHL. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You can find me over on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So in segment 2 here, we're talking about 3 players that could take a step back. And surprise, surprise, they are players that put up career numbers last season. And let's talk about in the first segment, in order to judge a player, it is what kind of season can they put together? How many seasons can they string together with success? Sometimes you'll see players where they have one really great season and then they disappeared. What happened to those players? So it'll be interesting. And that's what I'm going to talk about in segment 2 is 3 players that I kind of am drilling down on that could take a season or take a step back. Now, Connor McMichael, on this show, I always talk about it needed to be the season of Connor McMichael, and we saw what he meant for the Capitals last season on that second line left wing, and the talk swirling out there is could he be that third line center for the Capitals next season? And I think that he is a legit part of the next wave of the Capitals. He skates well, he plays with good pace, got good vision. But here's the thing for me is his career on ice shooting percentage before last season was around 10.4%. That's pretty average, right? Last year, it jumps to 13.1%. Now, that's not just a little bump. When you take a look at it, it seems pretty insignificant when you look at it. That's a full percentage swing and makes a huge difference in total points. And you might be saying, what are you saying here, Dan? What does that mean? It means some of those pucks that went in last year might not this year. What are some of the things we know about Connor McMichael? Is he likes to hang out in front of the net and score those greasy goals. He is a guy that is prone to being a little bit hot and cold. We saw that. He did not have sustained success across the entire season. So it'll be interesting to see how he does next season. And a lot of that, of course, will be determined on where he slots in. I think that you ostensibly could see that same success if he stays on that second line left wing. It's a bit more murky if he does move to that third line center, because who is going to be surrounded? We could pencil in Leonard and say, or Bavillier, something like that. But what if it's Cristall? What if it's Miro that we don't know? Or, there's Sonny Milano. There's so many things that we don't know. So it gets a bit difficult. I think that, with Connor McMichael, it's a bit too early, but just based on history and the fact that his numbers in shooting, for example, last season were down a little bit, that it could change this next season. And the next player I'm going to talk about here as well is Pierre-Luc Dubois, the player that came to the Capitals last season after Darcy Kemper got dealt out to the Kings. In return, the Capitals got Pierre-Luc Dubois, an 8-year deal with the Capitals. Well, 8-year with the Kings, traded over to the Capitals, and it was met with a lot of skepticism, a lot of sneering. What are the Capitals doing? They know he's a cancer in the locker room. They know he can't perform. That's the hard part. And a kind of a touchy one with Capitals fans is I think he took steps forward during the season, and a lot like some of the other players, specifically in the second round of the playoffs against the Canes, took a step back and has always been kind of a polarizing guy in the NHL, because people point to the season before with the Kings, and he was just mismatched, misutilized. They point to his stops in Winnipeg and Columbus, that fans either like his game or they don't. And it's hard to make them change their mind, because even at the end of last season, despite all that he had done, I had heard from some Kings fans that, it's not going to last. It's just not going to last. And Caps fans, we're still adjusting after that trade with LA. Dubois had a nice bounce back, 66 points, career high in assists. But here's the catch. His on-ice shooting percentage was 4.3 higher than his career average. That's a lot. So he did, a lot like a lot of other players with the Capitals, put up some big numbers. But, the hard part, like I've talked about in this episode, is players that kind of disappeared in the playoffs. 10 games, 3 assists. That's it. That dynamic second line center for the Capitals really cooled off in the playoffs when the Capitals needed him the most. And, that might be closer to what he is really at this stage. A solid player, but not a 66-point guy per year. And at $8 million, that hurts. Some people are still saying, what kind of player is he going to be a couple of years down the road? The one thing that I know for him for sure is that he played well during the regular season. And, we can maybe point to the postseason as a one-off. But I think that as long as he is surrounded by great players, I expect him to maintain. But like I talked about with Connor, could take a step back. It's kind of too early to say, but it is an interesting player to look at as well. Another player to close this segment out is Alexei Protas. And a guy that definitely thrived, in my estimation, playing at times with Alex Ovechkin. 30 goals, 66 points. I mean, who saw that coming? He'd never even hit 10 goals in a season before. Do you see what I'm getting at with some of these players? That last year was the high watermark for a lot of these players. His shooting percentage, 9.5 higher than his career average. His on-ice shooting percentage way up, and the Ovechkin factor massive. So, I think that some of those things aren't easily quantifiable, but if you're skating on Ovi's line while he's chasing history, I think it's a safe thing to say that you're getting points. But, like I talked about with the previous two players, the question is can he repeat it? Can he hit 30 again? But he's not going to be back to 6 either. So it's interesting. The truth is probably in the middle, maybe 18 to 22 goals, 45 to 50 points, still a valuable player on this team. And, this is just kind of taking, a law of averages, right? I think that when you take a look at a law of averages, that doesn't mean that they are a definitive thing. It's just kind of points in a direction. I would love nothing more than these players to take steps forward and even become better players. It's just that when I look at 3 players on this team that put up career numbers last year and maybe weren't so great before that or in the recent past, that you can kind of draw into question what kind of players they could be in the following year. But the thing of it is, the Caps team shooting percentage comes down, which it probably will. Then everybody's number dips. It's not just McMichael, Dubois, and Protas. It could be Wilson, Strome, or even Carlson seeing secondary assists dry up. And, I would like to think the Capitals take a step forward. But, it's a team, and I had quite comments from people online that this team was built to play well during the regular season, but when it got real in the playoffs, you could see the weaknesses exposed. They played pretty well against the Canadiens and got dispatched in a hurry against the Hurricanes. That you're hoping that these players that put up numbers can sustain that. You're hoping that the young players that you're drawing into the fold can help contribute. Because, I hate to say, you take a look at Leonard, a very small sample size. We can't have that next season. We need him to hit his groove. If Cristall makes the team, we need him contributing. Same thing goes for Miro and all of these guys, these kind of bubble players, so the Capitals can continue to keep marching forward and making a deeper push than just the second round. That is my hope for this team anyway. All right, so coming up here after the break, we're talking about steps back. But where could the Capitals take a step forward? The power play comes to mind. I'll discuss straight ahead. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The best way that you can help grow the show is to subscribe to Locked On Capitals on YouTube and comment anything down below. In the final segment of the show today, we're talking about a power play reset. Special teams, big picture for the Capitals, was one of their strengths, and at points, some of the weaknesses on this team. That you think to yourself, of course, that your team would have won more games had they been dialed in on the power play, for example, or on the PK. And if you are an everydayer of the show, I spoke about last season that in what we saw in the preseason games in the early part of last season, was that the special teams was a bit lacking in the luster department, if you will. And I said, it's important then, but you're going to see that drawn even more into focus the further we go along in the season and in the postseason. And well, surprise, surprise, that was the case, that the special teams at points struggled. In this final segment, I'll talk about the power play, that if the Capitals team as a whole takes a step back in certain metrics, they could also push forward if they can dial in the power play. So that is what we're going to talk about in the final segment of the show today. And, you take a look at the Capitals power play, especially last, I think what you're going to say, it's streaky. Some nights it looked elite, other nights it looks like they never practiced it. And when you got Ovechkin and Carlson both aging, this is a big season for that unit. Alex Ovechkin and John Carlson could very likely be playing their last season, in Ovechkin's case in the NHL, or in John Carlson's case for the Capitals. If for some reason he doesn't come to terms with the Caps, of course, I would expect him to join another team or to get traded to another team unless he voluntarily wants to step back. And it's the big off-season acquisitions, right? Jacob Chychrun being locked in, that's huge. He gives them flexibility. He can quarterback one unit, let Carlson run the other, or they can rotate depending on, the matchups and what team they're playing. And despite Alex Ovechkin going into his age 40 season, his 21st season in the league, Ovechkin is still a weapon on that left circle. Like I say, going into the next season at 40, that shot scares goalies. And one of the things that was said is they know it's coming. They just don't know how to stop it. And that's kind of been true for the duration of his career. I would say that the goalies now, I would say that the team's big picture now are more prepared for it. So in some cases, they're double covering a player, right? But that also leaves other players exposed to shoot the puck. You see Ovechkin kind of used as a decoy, if you will, at certain points, that everyone will rush over to the left side where the guy that's on the right, like, hey, just shoot it to me. The net is just gaping open. That works. And, they've tried to mix things up with Ovechkin, to not just have him set up from his office, that left circle, to make the teams guess a little bit more, to make the goalies guess a little bit more. And I think that he likes to return to where he's comfortable, like an old pair of shoes, that left circle, because that, I think, is where his mind is calibrated to just really drive it home. But I think that we did see steps forward in that. But at 40, still impressive, still a lethal threat. But the question is, it's the forwards. Yeah, and I think you know who I'm talking about here. Strome, Wilson, and Dubois, they locked in on PP1. McMichael probably runs PP2 down the middle. Protas should see more time as well. I think that he is a big contributor. Bavillier's back, and you got the kids, Leonard, Cristall, Miroshnichenko. They're all hungry to prove that they belong, that they can be contributors. But that's the thing, is sustainability with that entire core. And who's going to work the best on the power play? Because at points it was their strengths, but there were points last season that it was a big weakness as well. So, what do? Do you give the vets the most minutes to play it safe? Peter Laviolette hockey, that I only want to play my veterans because they're a proven commodity, where, guys like Connor McMichael? Or do you risk mistakes and let the kids learn? Put Leonard in there, Miro, Cristall. That I don't think that we need to sell them short. I mean, they are where they are based on the reputation and the numbers that they put up. But personally, I'd love to see one of the young guys run PP2 and get a real look to see what they have in the tank, and kind of adjust from there. Maybe make them on PP1 and just let it play out. Because like I said, at some point, we know that OV Carlson are going to be stepping away. And a player that, I've circled, I really, really expect him to make this roster next season, is Cristall. He's got the hands, the vision, and the creativity to make a power play click. Dynamic, circle it. I could pencil him in, like I've said, on that second line left wing. Look, be the X factor. If the Capitals as a team took a step back in shooting percentage, for example, the power play becomes that safety net for the team, that they could, push things forward. Special teams can keep you alive in a playoff race, and the best teams that, survive. You take a look at the Panthers, these kind of, that most of them, they have it locked down. Their PP, their PK are dialed in. So if the Caps can fix the power play, it might offset some of that regression that I talked about in the previous two segments. But I think it's going to require different approaches, right? We can't continue to see Alex Ovechkin exclusively setting up from that left dot, because at some point that's not going to even be an option. And I hate to say that out loud, but I think that the Capitals as an organization have done the right thing by drafting good players that are going to put them in a really good position in years to come. That I think they need to peel the Band-Aid off, that you're going to have, if you're going to have these big young players on the team, like the ones I mentioned in this episode, then you're going to have to give them some responsibility to prove themselves. You can't just say, well, I'm not going to give you that responsibility because I'm concerned you're going to fail. Let them have the responsibility until they prove otherwise. I think that on PP1, you stick with a lot of the veterans, slowly integrate some of the younger players into PP2 and see what they have. You might be surprised, and you shouldn't be really surprised. I think that, us as people, as sports fans, we're comfortable with rooting for the sure thing, Ovechkin, Carlson, Wilson, these kind of guys. But I think that it's time. The time is now to root for Cristall, Miro, Leonard, these kind of guys, because like it or not, those are going to be the faces of the future for your favorite hockey team and mine, the Washington Capitals. It is in time to brace the youth. It is in time to embrace making some changes. If the Capitals could change their power play from a weakness to a strength, that could be an absolute game changer in 25-26. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You are what makes this show successful. When you're done here, head on over to Locked On NHL, as they have you covered 5 days a week. available wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.